Chapter 1. When Athena's pet owl caused an international incident. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something rather unusual, though, in retrospect, perhaps entirely fitting for a sleepless history dive. Settle in, dim the lights if you haven't already, and let yourself drift into the soft, gentle murmur of ancient Athens. No need to rush. Tonight we're not chasing battles or empires, just following a slightly fussy owl and the very particular humans who decided it should matter to the rest of the world. Picture, if you will, Athens in the late 5th century BC. It's one of those cities that seems charming at first glance. Marble columns gleaming in the sunlight, citizens chatting in the marketplace, and the occasional philosopher wandering by muttering about the forms, or perhaps just muttering because he forgot where he put his sandals. The city was bustling, yet somehow, in the middle of all this civic pride and philosophical pondering, someone decided it was a good idea to keep a pet owl. Not just any owl, mind you, but a bird that would come to be infamous for reasons entirely unrelated to its hunting skills. The owl in question belonged to Athena herself, or at least, that's what the storybook version would have you believe. In reality, it belonged to the temple keepers, priests, and assorted hangers-on who insisted that they were merely caretakers of divine property. This owl, sleek and snowy with eyes that looked like polished amber, had grown rather used to being fawned over. It was fed more than most citizens, and it certainly received more attention than the average citizen would in their lifetime. Some sources say it had a soft spot for the high priests, who found it easier to whisper secrets to the bird than to share them with each other. Now, here's where things begin to drift into slightly uncomfortable territory, though still perfectly suitable for bedtime reflection. The owl, let's call it simply the owl, as history has, had a penchant for things. Not gold, not jewels, but scrolls. Small, delicate scrolls, usually with records of city taxes, minor decrees, and occasional philosophical musings. The owl would snatch them up when no one was looking, fly across the courtyard, and perch somewhere inconvenient. The priests, naturally, found this both irritating and, somehow, vaguely divine. If Athena herself wanted some bureaucratic oversight, who were they to argue? What makes this story peculiar isn't just the owl's tendency to hoard sensitive documents. It's what happened next. One morning, or perhaps late afternoon, records are vague on this, probably because everyone was too busy trying not to be embarrassed. The owl decided to fly beyond the familiar borders of the Acropolis. Perhaps it was boredom, or perhaps the owl simply fancied a change of scenery, but it landed, quite deliberately, in the courtyard of a visiting diplomat from Sparta. Now, Athens and Sparta had a complicated relationship. To put it mildly, they were neighbors with similar tastes in sandals, slightly differing tastes in government, and an almost uncanny ability to dislike one another while pretending to be polite. And here came the owl, swooping in like a feathered envoy from Athena herself, carrying what could only be described as top-secret city gossip, tax records, correspondence, minor decrees, possibly a note on someone's unsavory dinner habits. The Spartan diplomat, naturally, was horrified. Not so much by the bird, but by the fact that Athens seemed incapable of controlling its wildlife, or, according to his slightly dramatic interpretation, its entire government. The owl, as if sensing the importance of its cargo, did not merely drop the scrolls. No, it perched on the diplomat's shoulder, tilted its head at him with what could only be described as judgment, and let out a soft, accusatory hoot. One can only imagine the internal monologue of this Spartan official, standing in the Athenian sun, as a tiny winged creature assessed his every move. Somewhere in Sparta, senators would later debate whether this was a literal omen or a metaphorical one, but at the moment, it was just mildly inconvenient and slightly terrifying. Athens, naturally, did not respond in a timely manner. The priests debated the matter extensively, perhaps over wine, perhaps over ambrosia-flavored honey cakes. Eventually, a decision was made: the owl must be recalled. But recalling a divinely favored owl is not as simple as calling a dog to heel. This owl had opinions, preferences, and apparently a minor vendetta against anyone who doubted its authority. It refused to return, insisting, through persistent flapping and occasional scroll tossing, that the diplomatic mission was more important than any mortal decree. What followed was a series of letters between Athens and Sparta. Now, these letters were quite civil, but consider the subtext. Dear Sparta, we apologize for our owl. It is, of course, a divine instrument and not subject to our petty human control. We will endeavor to retrieve it. And Sparta replying with equal politeness but slightly less patience. Dear Athens, your owl has insulted our sensibilities and potentially compromised our strategic plans. Kindly restrain your feathered ambassador. And so it continued, a correspondence that would likely induce mild sleepiness in anyone reading it aloud, though it was, at the time, a source of moderate diplomatic tension. It took nearly a week, a few bribed couriers, and a particularly persuasive offering of dried fish before the owl was convinced to return to the Acropolis. Historians speculate that it was not the treaties, nor the letters, but the promise of new scrolls and a slightly comfier perch that finally persuaded the bird. Upon its return, the owl received a hero's welcome from the priests, and Athens quietly hoped Sparta would forget the incident, which, of course, they did not. What's fascinating, though, isn't merely the owl's misadventures, it's what happened afterward. The story made its way into chronicles, but not as a humorous anecdote. No, it was catalogued alongside wars, famines, and political intrigue. Future generations read about the owl and, unsurprisingly, imagined a world where divine creatures could influence human affairs in the most inconvenient ways. And in some sense, they were right. The owl had not started a war, but it had exposed the fragility of human pride, the absurdity of bureaucracy, and, perhaps most importantly, the very particular temperament of Athenian wildlife. Some historians suggest that the owl's actions had indirect consequences. Athens and Sparta did not go to war over an owl, but perhaps they might have, had the owl been slightly larger or slightly more aggressive. It's an interesting thought experiment. One small, mostly indifferent animal altering the course of diplomatic relations, if only temporarily. In sleepier reflection, one can almost see it. The owl perched serenely atop a scroll, observing human anxiety, and thinking, quite reasonably, that it was all very dramatic for something so easily fixable with a wing flap and a hoot. Let's float over to another small disaster, equally quiet and equally ridiculous, though this one involves less divine intervention and more human stubbornness. Consider the life of Polycrates, tyrant of Samos, who apparently thought that losing a ring at sea was some kind of cosmic joke. He didn't. But that story is for another time, after we've drifted a little deeper into this calm, mild historical river. And before we move on, it's worth noting the moral, or perhaps the gentle observation. Here, history is often shaped by the tiny, sleepy creatures we underestimate. Not generals, not kings, not even particularly clever philosophers. Sometimes, it's the owl who decides that a week of diplomatic inconvenience is more entertaining than peace. And if nothing else, that's a comforting thought as you settle into your pillow tonight. The world has always been a little absurd, and history, sleep-inducing, dry, and mildly judgmental, has been quietly recording it all. With that, let's linger a moment on the image of the owl, perched atop the Acropolis in the late afternoon sun, eyes like polished amber, quietly observing the affairs of mortals, and perhaps plotting its next minor inconvenience. You can almost hear it thinking with a gentle shake of feathers, they take this very seriously, but really, it's just a scroll. Chapter 2. Polycrates and the Cosmic Ring. Polycrates, tyrant of Samos, had a reputation that makes modern historians yawn in disbelief while simultaneously scribbling frantic footnotes. He was, by most accounts, astonishingly successful at holding power, which is a polite way of saying he was stubborn, lucky, and occasionally oblivious. His life reads like a series of minor absurdities stitched together with the occasional naval victory, but it's one of those histories that works best if you imagine it in slow motion, preferably while lying down. Polycrates was convinced that luck, in his case, was more than a passing fancy. He believed it was an almost tangible force, like honey-scented air that could be trapped, used, or occasionally squandered on an ill-advised feast. And indeed, he seemed to have luck in abundance. He captured islands, built fortifications, and generally kept Samos stable, all while his neighbors squinted in disbelief. The problem, as he soon discovered, is that too much luck is almost as inconvenient as too little. The most famous anecdote, and certainly the one best suited for sleepy reflection, involves a ring. Not a crown, not a sword, just a ring. A small, unassuming piece of jewelry. One morning, or possibly a sleepy afternoon, Polycrates decided to wear the ring. He admired it briefly, as people tend to do with shiny things, and then, as if fate were conspiring against him in the most polite way possible, the ring slipped from his finger and disappeared into the sea. Now, you might think this is a trivial incident. A ring lost at sea happens all the time. But Polycrates, as was his custom, treated it as if the universe had issued him a very pointed memo. He fretted. He paced. He may even have muttered philosophical questions about the impermanence of material wealth, though historical records are unclear on the exact wording. What is clear is that he consulted his advisors, who, naturally, had spent their careers learning that advising a tyrant on personal calamities is a delicate exercise in careful nodding. The advisors, after much polite hemming and hawing, suggested that Polycrates should throw something equally valuable into the sea. Not as a protest, not as a statement, but rather as a way to balance cosmic forces. In other words, if the sea takes something, give it something in return. Possibly it will forgive you. Polycrates, ever obedient to minor superstition, followed their advice. He selected his most prized treasure, a collection of gemstones, or possibly a particularly ornate cup, depending on which source you trust, and cast it into the waves. This story, of course, is exactly the sort of historical minutiae that gently lulls listeners into a calm haze. The imagery is quiet, the sun glinting off the waves, the soft splash of jewels disappearing into the blue, and Polycrates staring contemplatively at the horizon, perhaps regretting that he ever liked shiny things at all. And yet, the tale doesn't end with a simple moral about cosmic balance. No, it continues in the slightly more absurd, slightly more tragic register that history often prefers. Soon afterward, Polycrates received a visitor, an Egyptian king named Amasis, who had apparently spent some time thinking about the inherent risks of being friendly with someone who throws gemstones into the sea when slightly upset. Amasis, careful and politically inclined, advised Polycrates to temper his good fortune. "Too much luck," he said in words probably intended to be calming but inevitably interpreted as ominous, "is dangerous. You should sacrifice a finger, or a goat, or possibly reconsider your wardrobe." Polycrates, who did not own a particularly fashionable wardrobe but appreciated dramatic gestures, ignored the advice. Instead, he continued to enjoy his luck unabated. Ships arrived safely in harbor. Harvests were satisfactory. Enemies were discouraged by a combination of fear and mild boredom. And the ring, of course, remained at the bottom of the sea, serving as a tiny reminder that even minor calamities can be transformed into spectacles of cosmic curiosity. It is tempting to imagine Polycrates lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling of his palace, counting his blessings in the form of minor jewels and fleeting victories. There is a comfort in the mundane, even in the life of a tyrant, and Polycrates seemed unusually adept at finding it. If the ring taught him anything, it was perhaps this: the world can be absurdly generous, absurdly cruel, and sometimes absurdly quiet. And if one listens closely, the waves themselves provide gentle commentary. Floating from Samos to the distant halls of Persia, another minor absurdity is waiting patiently. Consider Cambyses too, who, unlike Polycrates, had a gift for quietly disastrous personal decisions. He ruled an empire, yet he managed to consistently treat cats with suspicious disdain, a choice that, in Egypt, was only slightly less alarming than losing a ring to the sea. Cambyses' story is best approached slowly, with a cup of lukewarm tea, imagining each misstep as a gentle ripple in the larger ocean of history. Cambyses, son of Cyrus the Great, inherited not only an empire but also a set of expectations that were moderately overwhelming. He spent much of his early reign attempting to live up to his father's accomplishments while simultaneously avoiding entirely preventable mishaps. One such mishap involved the sacred animals of Egypt. Cats, as you may know, were treated with reverence there. Killing a cat, even accidentally, was considered a serious offense. Cambyses, however, either misunderstood this cultural nuance or considered it a minor inconvenience. The result was a series of diplomatic headaches, none of which escalated dramatically, but all of which contributed to the general perception that Cambyses was somewhat unreliable in matters requiring delicate touch. Meanwhile, back in Greece, the tiny but determined owl of Athens had apparently inspired a minor literary tradition. Poets began writing soft, sleepy verses about the complications of divine pets. Philosophers mused quietly about the owl as a symbol of unpredictable intervention in human affairs. And somewhere in Samos, Polycrates' ring remained underwater, quietly influencing the imaginations of storytellers who preferred gentle absurdity to heroic exploits. In reflecting on these incidents, it becomes clear that history does not always need grand battles or sweeping empires to be interesting or sleep-inducing. Sometimes it is the tiny events, a ring lost at sea, a jewel thrown to the waves, an owl's minor diplomatic breach, or a cat treated with suspicious negligence. These small, quiet moments offer a peculiar rhythm, a gentle lull, as if the past itself were sighing and saying, there. It wasn't that serious. Let's drift toward another quietly tragic, mildly absurd story, the life of young Edward of England, who inherited a crown before he had grown accustomed to shoes. Edward, later known as Edward II, had an affinity for simplicity, an unfortunate taste in companions, and an uncanny ability to attract political awkwardness. His reign, much like Polycrates' ring, was a series of minor disasters strung together with occasional pomp and ceremony, best appreciated in a slow, monotone narration. Edward's upbringing was suffused with expectations and mild discomforts. His tutors were precise, his garments occasionally itchy, and his advisors gently persistent in offering advice that he largely ignored. Edward possessed, by most accounts, a reflective nature, preferring music, poetry, and the occasional quiet stroll in the gardens of the palace. But these preferences were ill-suited to the political intrigues of England, where noble squabbles could escalate over the mildest of disagreements, such as the proper height of a banquet chair or the exact shade of purple appropriate for a cloak. Edward's companions, many of whom were older and considerably more politically aware, exerted subtle influence over him, sometimes to his benefit, often to his disadvantage. The story of Edward, much like Polycrates and the owl, is not dramatic in the conventional sense. There were no earthquakes, no miraculous battles, just a gentle succession of awkward decisions, misplaced loyalty, and occasional oversights that would, over time, contribute to a slightly tragic reputation. This pattern, which we can observe quietly drifting through the annals of history, is remarkable. Consider how easily one misplaced ring, one small owl, one neglected cat, or one ill-advised friendship can ripple outward. The consequences are rarely immediate or violent. They are subtle, sometimes boring, but persistent. And in their persistence, they create a strange, almost hypnotic rhythm that is perfectly suited for bedtime reflection. Edward, for instance, might have been frustrated to learn that his well-intentioned choices, such as giving preferential treatment to certain companions or ignoring subtle political advice, were quietly undermining his authority. But from a distance, and with a calm, steady voice narrating, these moments are more melancholic than alarming. One can imagine Edward staring out a window, noticing the play of sunlight on the palace moat, and thinking, with the faintest sigh, that perhaps the world could be slightly simpler. And so, as our narrative drifts gently onward, it is worth noting a recurring theme. History, when observed slowly, without the interruptions of dramatic punctuation, is composed of small, oddly amusing, and sometimes tragic incidents. An owl carrying scrolls, a lost ring, a poorly treated cat, a king with questionable companions. All of these are threads in a fabric that is not dazzling, not urgent, but quietly compelling in a lulling, almost soporific way. Chapter 3: The Hapless Henry and the Poisoned Pottage. Henry VI of England is a figure who embodies gentle chaos with the efficiency of a sleepy cat. He inherited the crown as an infant, which is always a charming start for a monarchy, because it allows everyone else to run things while the king sits quietly, likely drooling on ceremonial robes and wondering why so many people are fussing over his teething schedule. Henry was, in every sense, the kind of king you'd nod off imagining, mild-mannered, devout, and vaguely incompetent in a way that never quite felt urgent, only inevitable. His reign was long, interrupted by brief interruptions of civil unrest that historians catalog with polite detachment. Henry had a peculiar affinity for religious devotion, gentle contemplation, and soft fabrics, all of which are excellent qualities if one's job is to write poetry or tend to gardens, but somewhat less effective for keeping a kingdom intact during a civil war. He would walk the halls of the palace, hands clasped, eyes downcast, muttering prayers, while courtiers whispered behind their hands about his inability to respond to the more practical aspects of kingship. One particularly notable incident involves a meal, which, as it turns out, was almost fatal, not politically but gastronomically. Henry was presented with pottage, a humble stew of vegetables, grains, and occasionally a small piece of meat. Someone, through a combination of negligence and poor hygiene, had prepared the stew with a mild dose of poison, though whether intentionally or accidentally is a matter historians still debate quietly over tea. The king, calm as a placid pond, consumed the meal with serene gratitude. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on perspective, the poison worked very slowly, providing only mild discomfort. This incident is less famous for drama and more for its subtle absurdity. The courtiers, in a flurry of polite concern, debated whether to blame the kitchen staff, the steward, or fate itself. Meanwhile, Henry, entirely unaware of the danger, continued his devotions, probably reciting psalms that describe gentle rivers and the soft fall of rain. It is a reminder that the life of a monarch is not always grand or heroic. Sometimes, it is merely a sequence of quietly perilous missteps, buffered by inattentive aids and miraculous coincidences. Henry's personal life was similarly calm yet tragic in minor ways. He married Margaret of Anjou, a woman of strength, decisiveness, and occasional impatience, a perfect foil to Henry's ethereal passivity. Margaret, as historical accounts note with gentle irony, had to carry the weight of ambition for both of them. She led armies, managed alliances, and endured the general chaos of 15th-century England, while Henry, understandably, continued his serene contemplation and frequent naps. One imagines him seated beneath a window, watching sunlight play across the floor, while Margaret negotiated treaties or dispatched messengers, muttering occasionally about the importance of waking her husband. The juxtaposition is particularly hypnotic. Henry, the passive dreamer, Margaret, the schemer and tactician. Their lives intersected at moments of quiet domesticity, meals, prayers, walks in the garden, punctuated by the sudden arrival of political crises that Henry generally observed from a distance, occasionally murmuring that perhaps the kingly duties could wait until after Vespers. It's a story that lulls the listener because the tension is mild and the consequences, while historically significant, are narrated here in a slow, monotone fashion, almost like a gentle stream flowing over smooth stones. Across Europe, contemporaries had their own minor tragedies and absurdities. Take the Habsburgs, whose commitment to dynastic purity is now legendary, and for good reason. The family engaged in what modern geneticists would politely call enthusiastic consanguinity, producing heirs with the kind of facial features that modern caricaturists delight in exaggerating. One member in particular, Charles II of Spain, suffered from an array of minor yet persistent health problems, which included difficulty speaking, walking, and chewing, issues that are tragic in their real-world implications, but in the flat tone of bedtime history, read almost like a series of bizarre, unfortunate coincidences. Charles II's life was structured around court rituals, medical treatments that likely did more harm than good, and a remarkably patient staff. He sat on a throne that was far too large, wore garments that were far too elaborate, and received counsel that was far too verbose. Yet he endured, a quiet testament to the resilience of humans, or at least, of royals who have little choice. His life, punctuated by minor physical setbacks and a family devoted to maintaining appearances, is exactly the sort of story that drifts by without startling the listener, yet lingers gently in the mind. Meanwhile, in France, Louis XIII was quietly adjusting to the peculiarities of power. He had a prime minister, Cardinal Richelieu, whose ambitions were vast, meticulous, and slightly intimidating, like a librarian who also commanded armies. Louis, by contrast, preferred hunting, music, and moderate amounts of introspection. He occasionally attempted to assert his authority but generally concluded that listening to Richelieu and nodding politely was easier than navigating the tangled web of court intrigue. The result is a reign that reads like a soft, continuous negotiation, punctuated by occasional hunting trips and carefully orchestrated prayers. Back in England, Henry VI continued his tranquil existence, punctuated by minor reversals, intermittent loss of territories, and the occasional heated discussion about whether to fund a campaign. From the outside, it may seem like a series of failures, but if one's perspective is calm and sleep-friendly, it reads as a gentle sequence of events in which no one is truly endangered in a spectacular way, merely inconvenienced and occasionally disappointed. Henry's final years, often described as melancholy, are particularly soothing in their repetition. He spent them quietly, with moments of political upheaval occurring just beyond the walls of his palace. His advisors whispered, Margaret strategized, armies moved, and Henry, steadfast as a stone in a slow river, maintained his meditative schedule, attending prayers, tending to small gardens, and occasionally receiving reports that he barely processed. This rhythm, the gentle cadence of minor disasters, quiet resilience, and inconspicuous human error, becomes a recurring motif as we drift further into the European courts. Consider Mary, Queen of Scots, whose life is equally punctuated by minor frustrations disguised as major crises. She was educated, intelligent, and quite aware that the world was a tricky place. And yet, much like Henry, her days were filled with small mishaps, letters intercepted, alliances misinterpreted, personal confidants who occasionally betrayed her, and an endless series of minor domestic annoyances that historians catalog with polite detachment. Mary's misfortunes are particularly suited for a sleep-inducing narrative because they are not sudden or shocking. There are no epic battles in which she personally wields a sword, no dramatic speeches delivered in the moonlight. There are merely days of careful observation, subtle maneuvering, and the quiet accumulation of setbacks that, in total, give the impression of a life gently buffeted by circumstance rather than dramatic catastrophe. One imagines her sitting by a window, listening to rain tapping on the stone walls of her residence, considering the absurdity of politics, and sighing gently. This brings us full circle, in a sense, to the earlier incidents of the owl, Polycrates' ring, and Henry's poison pottage. History, when observed without urgency, is composed of small, peculiar events that ripple outward with varying degrees of consequence. Each story shares a calm absurdity, a quiet tragedy, or a mild inconvenience. The rhythm of these tales, narrated slowly and without emotional peaks, creates a gentle, hypnotic cadence that encourages reflection, gentle amusement, and ultimately, drowsiness. And so, we drift once more toward a quietly unfortunate figure, Ivan IV of Russia, better known as Ivan the Terrible. Unlike Henry VI, Ivan's life is punctuated by moments of genuine distress, yet even here, in this narrative, the focus is on minor domestic and personal absurdities rather than violence. Ivan was meticulous, obsessive, and often perplexed by the behaviors of those around him, including his own advisors and family members. He displayed a fascination with architecture, elaborate court rituals, and occasionally perplexing decisions about household management, all of which are soothing when narrated in a slow, monotone fashion. Ivan's court was full of intrigues that were irritating rather than alarming. Misplaced keys, disputes over table settings, and gentle misunderstandings of protocol created a quiet tension that, when observed from a comfortable chair with dimmed lights, is more meditative than dramatic. His personal life, marked by careful attention to ceremony and ritual, provides a soothing rhythm for the listener, allowing one to contemplate the minor absurdities of power without feeling threatened by them. And so, as we float gently through these corridors of history, it becomes clear, the world has always been inhabited by figures whose lives are slightly tragic, slightly absurd, and perfectly suited to bedtime reflection. The owl, Polycrates, Henry VI, Charles II, Louis XIII, Mary, and Ivan, all demonstrate the quiet, peculiar ways in which humans navigate authority, luck, and circumstance. The stories unfold slowly, without the sharp edges of sudden conflict, allowing the listener to relax into the steady, soporific cadence of past lives observed from a gentle distance. Chapter 4. The Habsburg Jaw and Other Quiet Disasters. The Habsburgs, one of Europe's most illustrious dynasties, were renowned for many things: sprawling territories, impeccable ceremonial dress, and an enthusiasm for marrying distant cousins that would make any modern geneticist faint softly in their armchair. Their story is a perfect example of history as gentle, relentless absurdity, like a stream that flows smoothly but carries the occasional pebble of tragedy. Charles II of Spain, often cited as the pinnacle of Habsburg achievement in this regard, was born into a world where every possible precaution had been taken to ensure dynastic purity. His family, after generations of cousin marriages, produced offspring who were, to put it mildly, distinct. Charles himself had what is now politely referred to as the Habsburg jaw, an extreme protrusion of the lower face that complicated speech, eating, and likely any attempt at subtlety. The portrait painters, loyal as they were, did their best, yet even their brushstrokes could not entirely disguise the quiet absurdity of the arrangement of features bestowed upon Charles by genetics and centuries of family tradition. His life was a sequence of minor tragedies and inconveniences. Charles had difficulty walking, required assistance for basic tasks, and suffered a variety of medical complaints that were chronic but not acutely dramatic. He ruled, technically, an empire. Practically, he spent much of his time attending carefully timed meals, receiving reports from ministers, and contemplating the occasional hymn. One imagines him seated at a massive, uncomfortable chair, with courtiers quietly wondering whether to address policy or merely ensure that the king had enough soft pillows. This combination of physical fragility and dynastic responsibility produced a reign that was both gently tragic and faintly absurd. Decisions were made for him by ministers, the empire continued largely through inertia, and Charles existed as a living example of how political power and personal weakness can coexist in a rhythm so slow that it lulls the observer rather than alarms them. The Habsburgs, naturally, did not learn from this. Subsequent generations continued the tradition of marrying within the family, creating a legacy of minor deformities, fragile children, and endless chronic illnesses that historians catalog with polite fascination. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Europe, Louis XIV of France was quietly establishing himself as the Sun King, a monarch whose extravagance is well documented but whose personal habits can lull the listener into a sort of calm awe. He rose to power young, under the careful guidance of his mother and Cardinal Mazarin, and quickly developed a fascination with routine, ceremony, and absolute control. His life was meticulously structured, rising at a precise hour, attending mass, reviewing ministers, and participating in dances that were more elaborate than many modern weddings. Louis's eccentricities were gentle in tone but constant. He adored shoes, particularly red ones, and insisted that court etiquette be maintained with almost ritualistic precision. Every day included a series of minor annoyances that, in his case, were treated as matters of grave consequence. Courtiers not bowing correctly, servants forgetting the precise arrangement of utensils, dancers stepping slightly out of line. And yet, from a sleepy, detached perspective, these are not alarming events. They are merely the slow, steady rhythm of royal life, marked by minor crises that resolve themselves with minimal fuss, if sometimes with a sense of quiet indignation. Similarly, Peter the Great of Russia was obsessed with modernization and European fashion, which, in a historical sense, is mildly entertaining. He forced his court to shave beards, adopt foreign clothing, and attend lengthy social exercises designed to impress foreigners. One can imagine the sleepy scene: Peter pacing in boots slightly too tight, courtiers shifting awkwardly, and the occasional noble muttering under their breath about how much easier life was when everyone had beards. The political and cultural consequences were significant, but for the listener in a dimly lit room, the absurdity of forcing grown men to dance in polished shoes is gently hypnotic. Even minor princes and lesser-known royals offer a similar rhythm of quiet misfortune. Consider Joachim of Brandenburg, who inherited titles he could barely manage and spent most of his adult life dealing with family disputes, minor military campaigns, and a chronic lack of enthusiasm for ruling. His reign is mostly remembered, if at all, for the occasional misfiled letter, an unappealing marriage, and a penchant for sighing heavily in the presence of advisors. These are, in aggregate, exactly the sorts of incidents that lull a listener into reflective calm. Human concerns made small, tangible, and slightly absurd. And then there are the children, of course. Royal children, who are always raised with excessive ceremony, unrealistic expectations, and far too much attention. Consider the life of young Louis XVII, whose brief existence was marked by imprisonment, uncertainty, and a court in chaos due to revolution. His story, while tragic, unfolds slowly in the historical record. Days spent in small rooms, meals carefully apportioned, attempts at comfort that mostly failed, and a gentle, persistent anxiety that permeated his caretakers' lives. Narrated in monotone, this story is more soporific than alarming, emphasizing the quiet mismanagement of expectation rather than any immediate drama. In Germany, the story of Ludwig II of Bavaria offers another example of gentle, almost hypnotic eccentricity. He loved castles, water, and music. He built elaborate structures that were beautiful but impractical, filled with winding staircases and endless corridors. His advisors frequently noted, with polite resignation, that Ludwig seemed more in love with fantasy than reality. One can almost hear the distant strains of a Wagnerian opera as he wanders from room to room, contemplating what to build next. The audience, comfortably seated, drifts along with him, lulled by the steady rhythm of personal obsession and architectural absurdity. Returning to Spain, the continuing Habsburg lineage produced Philip IV, who managed to combine a taste for art, personal indulgence, and a mild inability to manage an empire effectively. His court was filled with painters, musicians, and sycophants, all quietly observing as the king spent hours contemplating a single portrait or a particularly intricate musical performance. Wars occurred in the background, diplomacy hummed along like a soft metronome, and Philip's life moved at the gentle pace of aesthetic appreciation rather than political urgency. The pattern, if observed slowly, becomes hypnotic. Minor eccentricities, gentle mismanagement, peculiar obsessions, and personal tragedies that are neither sudden nor dramatic. Each royal, from Charles II's Habsburg jaw to Ludwig II's wandering fascination with castles, demonstrates that human life, even at the height of power, can be composed of repetitive, quiet, slightly absurd moments. These moments, strung together, form a narrative rhythm that is particularly suitable for bedtime reflection. Even the petty rivalries and minor diplomatic disputes of the era contribute to this soothing pattern. Letters misdelivered, insults misunderstood, and ceremonial slights unremarked upon at the time all ripple slowly through history. They do not shock, they do not start wars in our bedtime narrative. Instead, they offer a steady cadence, a series of minor pulses in the otherwise calm river of human affairs. One imagines courtiers shuffling papers, advisors nodding politely, and kings and queens sighing, often without uttering a word, as history meanders on. Chapter 5. Sickly Sovereigns and Subtle Mishaps. Some monarchs seem to have a talent for turning minor personal inconveniences into extended historical footnotes. Consider Queen Joanna of Castile, often known as Joanna the Mad. Her epithet, while dramatic, was less about screaming fits or outright lunacy and more about prolonged melancholy and obsession with minor domestic matters. She was profoundly devoted to her husband, Philip the Handsome, a man whose own ambitions and habits might be politely described as inconsistent, and spent much of her later life wandering, quietly upset, through palaces and estates, accompanied by attendants who learned the delicate art of polite patience. Joanna's melancholy is a gentle form of history, the kind that encourages a slow, reflective pace. She did not lead armies into battle, nor did she plot bloody coups. Instead, she moved slowly through a world increasingly controlled by others, her moods oscillating with a calm subtlety that could only be described as endlessly patient. When she became concerned about her husband's death, she did not respond with drama so much as quiet determination, following his body from city to city. Courtiers and guards, weary from their duties, learned to accommodate her obsessive attention with the soft sighs of people accustomed to slow, inconsequential calamities. Meanwhile, in Italy, Ferdinando II of Naples was navigating the delicate balance of kingship and personal whimsy. He enjoyed music, hunting, and an odd fascination with small mechanical devices, things that are quiet, personal, and perfect for a sleep-inducing narrative. Ferdinando's reign is notable less for military conquests and more for minor administrative quirks, misplaced decrees, small-scale disputes over land titles, and gentle irritation at courtiers who failed to follow his specific instructions about banquet arrangements or the proper folding of royal linens. One can imagine the scene vividly: a stately hall, polished floors reflecting candlelight, an anxious steward cautiously presenting documents to Ferdinando, who nods politely while mentally noting the misalignment of the text or the slightly worn edge of a seal. The tension is muted, the stakes are low, and yet the narrative unfolds with the subtle rhythm of human folly. Of course, no discussion of mildly absurd royals would be complete without mentioning the famously inbred Portuguese and Spanish Habsburgs. Their genealogies read like complex puzzles, branches intertwining with such obsessive regularity that modern historians quietly sigh at the effort required to track them. The consequence of this practice was a series of heirs with fragile constitutions, peculiar facial features, and a consistent inability to thrive in anything other than a highly controlled environment. They often lived long enough to inherit titles, but their health dictated a life of gentle oversight rather than vigorous ruling. One particularly notable example is Maria Anna of Spain, whose life was spent navigating the labyrinth of court etiquette, familial expectation, and mildly inconvenient health problems. She did not die tragically young in the sense of sudden collapse. Instead, her days unfolded slowly, with minor ailments, careful meals, and a steady succession of diplomatic obligations that were as repetitive as they were unthreatening. From a narrative perspective, this is ideal bedtime material, history that is quietly detailed, mildly frustrating, and perfectly devoid of adrenaline. Further north, in Scandinavia, Christian IV of Denmark and Norway exhibited the peculiar combination of energy and impracticality. He embarked on building projects, reorganized bureaucracies, and pursued personal hobbies with remarkable persistence. Yet his endeavors were often only mildly effective, resulting in gentle economic strain and a series of small, persistent frustrations among his advisors. One can imagine him inspecting a partially constructed palace, noting that the angles were slightly off, while the builders grimaced politely and hoped that perhaps the king would be satisfied if someone merely nodded. These are the rhythms of power in miniature: persistence, human error, and an ever-present undercurrent of minor chaos. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, Sigismund III of Poland-Lithuania spent his reign oscillating between personal religious devotion and the careful management of a sprawling, diverse territory. His court was filled with advisors, clergy, and minor nobility, each with their own ambitions and quirks. The king's personal inclinations, quietly pious, mildly eccentric, and intermittently melancholy, created a reign that was remarkably stable, yet gently amusing when observed in retrospect. The crown passed through ceremonies and proclamations with careful attention, yet the human element, misplaced letters, misinterpreted gestures, and the occasional minor illness provided a slow, persistent cadence that underscores the gentle humor of historical narrative. Even monarchs with reputations for more dramatic behavior, such as Napoleon Bonaparte, reveal small, quietly absurd personal habits when viewed in this slow, reflective light. Napoleon, for all his ambition, was meticulous about minor details: the arrangement of tents, the precise folding of maps, and the composition of letters. He worried about the smallest disruptions to routine, fretted over the positioning of troops in ways that rarely mattered in the grander sweep of history, and maintained a personal obsession with health and hygiene that occasionally conflicted with military strategy. Observed in slow motion, these tendencies are not alarming. They are hypnotically repetitive, gentle quirks that make a listener's eyes grow heavy. Similarly, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, better known as Sisi, spent much of her life in pursuit of beauty, freedom, and mild eccentricity. Her days included rigorous beauty regimens, long horseback rides, and careful observation of court etiquette. She resisted the constraints of palace life in subtle, elegant ways, such as by traveling incognito or refusing to attend certain formal events. These choices created minor crises for her advisors but, from a calm narrative perspective, read like a slow-moving dance of human stubbornness and personal indulgence. And then there is the quiet absurdity of monarchs whose misfortune is amplified by circumstance rather than innate temperament. Consider Charles I of England, whose reign was marked by conflict and tension that, when narrated slowly, becomes almost soporific in its inevitability. His insistence on divine right, his occasional disregard for parliamentary procedure, and his penchant for elaborate court ceremonies created a predictable series of political frustrations. Yet, observed in the gentle monotone of bedtime history, these frustrations are more like ripples on a pond than violent storms. One imagines Charles pacing softly in his private chambers, sighing, while courtiers shuffle papers and ministers mutter softly about the next inevitable disagreement. The pattern emerges clearly. History is replete with figures whose lives are composed of minor inconveniences, gentle eccentricities, and persistent, low-level challenges. They do not scream, they do not leap from rooftops in dramatic flourish. They merely exist in their peculiar circumstances, navigating the slow current of human affairs. The result, for the listener reclining in a dim room, is a rhythmic, almost hypnotic narrative, perfectly suited for the slow drift toward sleep. Even when misfortune strikes, it is often gentle, almost bureaucratic in its subtlety. Illness, awkward marriages, minor diplomatic failures, and misplaced trust recur like a soft refrain. The listener is lulled not by grand spectacle but by repetition, the careful unfolding of human error, and the quiet persistence of circumstance. In this way, the lives of royals and elites become a sort of historical lullaby, each anecdote a note in a gentle, ongoing symphony of mildly tragic human experience. Chapter 6: The Curious Cases of Inbred Dynasties. If one wishes to examine history through the gentle lens of quiet absurdity, few subjects are as hypnotically suited as the inbred European dynasties. Over generations, these families perfected the art of marrying within the family to an almost obsessive degree, producing heirs whose lives were composed of minor physical challenges, quiet melancholy, and endless ceremonial obligations. The Habsburgs, already familiar from earlier chapters, exemplify this trend, but they are by no means alone. Consider Philip II of Spain, a king whose reign is often remembered for territorial expansion, religious fervor, and, less dramatically, persistent personal discomfort. Philip was meticulous, deeply pious, and slightly prone to melancholy, all traits that fit perfectly into the gentle rhythm of historical misfortune. He suffered from a variety of minor ailments, including digestive issues, which, while uncomfortable, did not disrupt the grand machinery of empire but did provide historians with endless notes about diet, hygiene, and royal discomfort. Philip's personal life was equally soporific in its complications. He married 4 times, each union producing varying degrees of offspring, some of whom thrived while others suffered quietly from inherited conditions. One can imagine Philip, seated on a chair slightly too low for his stature, carefully reviewing the latest reports of court births, weighing each development with calm attention, and sighing gently at the inevitable complications. From a bedtime perspective, it is soothing, no sudden drama, merely the slow unfolding of human circumstance. Meanwhile, in Austria, the Habsburg obsession with dynastic purity reached its zenith in Leopold I. He inherited a network of familial obligations so extensive that it required constant attention, careful negotiation, and an almost ritualistic adherence to genealogical charts. His children, educated, pious, and occasionally frail, grew up in a court that emphasized ceremony over spontaneity and duty over leisure. Leopold himself was meticulous, attending to minor details of protocol with a quiet, almost hypnotic focus. Courtiers, accustomed to his slow rhythms, moved through the palace in a muted dance of petitions, approvals, and polite sighs. The consequences of inbreeding were subtle yet persistent. Charles II of Spain, as noted earlier, suffered from the most extreme manifestations: the Habsburg jaw, fragile health, and limited mobility. Other family members experienced milder effects, such as partial deafness, minor intellectual difficulties, or peculiar physical traits that required careful accommodation. These conditions were catalogued with gentle precision by court physicians and advisors, each observation contributing to a rhythm of quiet, predictable misfortune. Beyond the Habsburgs, one encounters similar patterns in Portugal and France. Infants were carefully observed, their growth charted meticulously, and their minor ailments noted with a steady hand. Some children were unable to walk or speak normally, while others displayed peculiar features that, while not dangerous, were considered undesirable. The parents, themselves products of generations of dynastic planning, navigated these challenges with a combination of devotion and resignation, ensuring that life continued according to ceremonial expectation. In France, Louis XV exemplifies this quiet, slow unfolding of personal quirks and minor misfortunes. He enjoyed leisure, hunting, and music, all while presiding over a court that demanded elaborate ceremonial observance. His children were similarly attended to with gentle diligence, their minor ailments and eccentricities carefully accommodated by a network of nurses, tutors, and advisors. In the slow rhythm of palace life, these details blend together into a kind of historical lullaby, soothing in its predictability and subtle in its implications. The psychological toll on these dynasties was mild but persistent. Children were taught obedience and ceremony at an early age, often at the expense of personal freedom or comfort. Education emphasized ritual, genealogy, and the careful management of minor social interactions. Play was limited, and deviations from protocol were noted quietly, sometimes resulting in corrective measures that were gentle in intent but firm in practice. It is in these minor, controlled experiences that the listener can find the soft cadence of historical life, small frustrations, slow adjustments, and the continuous maintenance of social order. Even the seemingly minor eccentricities of adult monarchs contribute to this rhythm. Consider Charles VI of France, whose bouts of melancholia and occasional disorientation were managed carefully by attendants and advisors. His episodes did not erupt into chaos so much as create a slow, persistent pattern of observation, management, and gentle accommodation. Courtiers learned to anticipate moods, prepare for lapses in memory, and maintain the ceremonial flow, all while the kingdom continued, largely uneventfully, around them. The same pattern emerges in Eastern Europe. Augustus III of Poland-Lithuania exhibited slow, deliberate behaviors that dictated the rhythm of court life. His personal interests, art, music, and minor administrative concerns, structured the day-to-day functioning of the court. Advisors, accustomed to his measured pace, coordinated minor disputes, ceremonial obligations, and diplomatic niceties with calm efficiency. Viewed in retrospect, his reign is a series of soft pulses rather than dramatic peaks, ideal for bedtime reflection. One may also consider the minor, yet persistent, inconveniences faced by European queens. Maria Theresa of Austria, despite her formidable intelligence and administrative skill, contended with domestic and dynastic pressures that were constant yet unthreatening. Managing children, negotiating marital arrangements, and maintaining the ceremonial decorum of her court produced a rhythm of gently recurring challenges. These were not crises in the dramatic sense, but rather a series of small, consistent pressures that demanded careful, patient attention, a pattern that soothes the listener when narrated in a calm, monotone fashion. Even minor miscalculations in health or protocol become part of this hypnotic cadence. A child falls ill, a courtier misplaces a letter, a ceremonial robe is slightly out of alignment. None of these incidents threaten the kingdom, yet they ripple softly through daily life. In this way, history is less a series of dramatic events and more a continuous, undulating sequence of human quirks and logistical concerns, each gently unfolding into the next. In Britain, the later Stuarts continued this rhythm of gentle misfortune. James II, with his unremarkable personal habits and relatively minor political misjudgments, created circumstances that allowed for slow, persistent tension. His reign is remembered as a series of minor conflicts, largely administrative or ceremonial, rather than dramatic battles or heroic feats. Each misstep, each carefully chronicled decision, contributes to the slow-moving narrative of history that invites the listener to drift along with it, eyes growing heavier with each repetition. And so, the pattern of inbred dynasties, eccentric monarchs, and minor domestic tragedies extends across Europe, creating a tapestry of gently repetitive human behavior. The lives of rulers, their children, and their advisors are filled with small, persistent incidents, carefully documented and softly narrated, forming a cadence perfectly suited to reflection and relaxation. The rhythm of history here is not urgent or alarming. It is soft, slow, and quietly mesmerizing. Even the most seemingly dramatic figures, when observed through this perspective, reveal only minor inconveniences magnified by expectation. Wars are catalogued with gentle detachment, diplomatic squabbles are recounted as mild inconveniences, and personal eccentricities are noted with soft amusement. The effect, for the listener reclining in dim light, is a lullaby of human frailty, persistence, and subtle absurdity, inviting sleep to creep gently forward. Chapter 7: Eccentricities and Endless Etiquette. By the 18th century, European courts had perfected the art of quiet absurdity. Monarchs were no longer merely rulers, they were carefully curated spectacles of ceremony, fashion, and minor personal quirks. The lives of these rulers, when observed at a slow pace, are perfectly suited to a sleepy, reflective narrative. Nothing happens suddenly, everything unfolds with deliberate, gentle inevitability. Louis XV of France, for instance, had a fascination with comfort and personal indulgence that is best appreciated slowly. His daily schedule included carefully timed wake-up rituals, extensive meals, long periods of study or contemplation, and the occasional stroll in the gardens of Versailles. Courtiers navigated his whims with polite resignation, ensuring that nothing was amiss in his view. The king was not rash or violent. He was patient, meticulous, and occasionally distracted by minor curiosities, a bird, a garden flower, or an intricate piece of embroidery. These small fascinations, while trivial, created a rhythm that subtly structured the lives of those around him. His private life was a gentle tapestry of routine and indulgence. Madame de Pompadour, his mistress and political confidant, managed court influence with quiet skill, negotiating favors, arranging audiences, and subtly guiding royal opinion. Even the most delicate decisions, what gown the queen might wear, which banquet menu was appropriate, were infused with mild tension, quickly diffused by ceremony and careful attention. These are the moments that lull the listener, human concerns, magnified slightly by the grandeur of court life, yet ultimately benign and predictable. Meanwhile, across the Channel, George II of Britain managed his dual role as King of England and Elector of Hanover with a curious mix of mild detachment and meticulous oversight. He spent much of his time attending court ceremonies, reviewing petitions, and quietly observing the habits of his ministers. His personal quirks included a preference for particular foods, a fondness for music, and a measured approach to decision-making that ensured the kingdom moved along with calm efficiency. Minor disputes among courtiers, small misalignments in protocol, and occasional domestic irritations provided gentle rhythm to the day-to-day life of the court. In Russia, Peter III's brief reign is perfect bedtime material. He ascended the throne with curiosity, naivety, and a fascination with European military models. His personal habits, fondness for Prussian uniforms, enthusiasm for orderly drills, and minor eccentricities in domestic routine produced a reign that was more a series of peculiar amusements than political drama. Advisors, soldiers, and servants adapted to his habits with careful patience, producing a slowly unfolding narrative of human behavior rather than a story of sudden events. Even in smaller courts, minor princes exhibited the same gentle absurdities. Charles Emmanuel III of Sardinia was diligent, methodical, and occasionally distracted by minor hobbies, such as stamp collecting or observing the construction of fortifications with excessive attention to detail. His life demonstrates that power need not be exciting to be interesting or sleep-inducing. One imagines him pacing softly, reviewing reports, correcting a misaligned seal, or sighing gently at the slow march of bureaucratic procedure. The domestic habits of monarchs also contribute to this hypnotic rhythm. Marie Antoinette, often remembered for extravagance, spent long hours attending to her personal routines, fashion, correspondence, and the management of her private apartments. Each minor decision, choice of gown, arrangement of furniture, or allocation of household duties, created gentle ripples through the court. Courtiers learned to anticipate these ripples, moving with the quiet, predictable cadence of trained dancers in a slow, ornate ballet of etiquette. Meanwhile, Charles III of Spain combined personal curiosity with careful administrative oversight. His interests ranged from architecture to urban planning, resulting in projects that were elaborate yet incremental. The slow, steady unfolding of his initiatives, improving roads, ordering buildings, reorganizing bureaucracy, is perfectly suited to a sleepy narrative. There is no sudden drama, no urgent peril. There is only the gentle rhythm of human ambition unfolding in deliberate, measured steps. Even monarchs whose reputations are more dramatic reveal subtle patterns when observed slowly. Catherine the Great of Russia, while ambitious and politically active, balanced her personal interests, literature, theater, and private gardens with the careful management of court life. Her advisors navigated both the intellectual demands and minor eccentricities of her reign, producing a slow, steady rhythm of small triumphs, minor annoyances, and carefully controlled influence. In the German states, Frederick the Great of Prussia exhibited eccentricity in a quiet, disciplined way. His obsession with music, philosophy, and orderly military exercises produced minor, persistent challenges for his staff and courtiers, yet nothing that would disturb the calm observer. Letters misfiled, drills conducted with obsessive precision, and philosophical discussions that lasted hours are all part of the slow-moving cadence of his reign. These gentle repetitions, devoid of sudden peaks, lull the listener much like a soft, unhurried stream flowing past smooth stones. Similarly, in Scandinavia, Gustav III of Sweden combined personal refinement with minor theatricality. He staged performances, reorganized court customs, and maintained a fascination with cultural pursuits. The minor inconveniences, letters arriving late, stage props misplaced, ceremonial misalignments, produced gentle tension that resolved slowly, providing a soothing rhythm for those observing from a distance. Even revolts and political unrest in his reign, when narrated softly and without heightened drama, become part of this hypnotic cadence. Inevitable, slow, and quietly amusing. Across Europe, the pattern persists. Monarchs and heirs, courtiers, and household staff all move through the same gently absurd motions. Careful attention to ceremony, minor mismanagement, and personal eccentricities. Misplaced letters, slightly off arrangements, minor illnesses, and small domestic dramas recur like waves, creating a slow, rhythmic pulse that guides the narrative forward without ever startling the listener. Even when crises arise, they are often mundane in nature. A courtier accidentally insults a queen, a ceremonial robe is slightly misaligned, a garden fountain malfunctions. None of these incidents threatens the stability of the kingdom in a dramatic sense. They are small disturbances that ripple gently through court life, producing tension that is mild, predictable, and ultimately soothing when recounted in a calm, monotone voice. Chapter 8: Royal Hobbies, Minor Mishaps, and Endless Ceremonies. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, European monarchs had developed a particularly gentle rhythm of life. Their days were filled with repetitive ceremonial obligations, minor eccentricities, and small domestic challenges, all of which created a steady, almost hypnotic pulse when observed at a slow pace. These rhythms are perfect for bedtime reflection. No sudden crises, no dramatic violence, just the slow unfolding of human habit and occasional misfortune. Take, for example, George III of Britain. Known to history for bouts of mental instability, his personal life is equally notable for quiet obsessions, gardening, architecture, and minor scientific curiosities. He meticulously oversaw the development of royal estates, corresponded carefully with ministers, and managed household affairs with a slow, deliberate hand. His domestic habits, though slightly unusual, produced a predictable, soothing rhythm. Letters arrived, gardens were pruned, rooms were inspected, and courtiers moved like carefully synchronized dancers in response to the king's gently fluctuating moods. The domestic challenges faced by George III were minor yet persistent. Servants occasionally misarranged linens, courtiers misunderstood protocol, and ministers reported matters with varying degrees of accuracy. Each minor lapse produced a ripple of attention, gently adjusted by the king or his household staff. These incidents are perfectly suited for narration in a calm, monotone voice. Small disturbances that fade back into the steady current of daily life without producing alarm or tension. Meanwhile, in Austria, Francis too carefully balanced the responsibilities of Holy Roman Emperor with his personal interests in music, hunting, and garden management. His days moved at a measured pace, structured around ceremonial obligations, correspondence, and the gentle oversight of family affairs. Minor inconveniences, letters delayed, ceremonial missteps, or misplaced documents, recurred regularly, providing a soft rhythm that punctuated the slow unfolding of dynastic history. Even in smaller courts, the pattern persists. Charles IV of Spain maintained a life of careful routine, attending to ceremonial duties, family matters, and personal hobbies with quiet diligence. His reign was marked less by dramatic events than by gentle, persistent administration. Advisors and courtiers adjusted to his rhythms, ensuring that minor missteps did not escalate, while he continued through his carefully structured days, observing the subtle details of court life with calm attentiveness. Napoleon Bonaparte, often remembered for dramatic military campaigns, also fits into this gentle pattern when observed at the level of personal habits. He was meticulous about clothing, camp arrangements, and correspondence. His days included hours of planning, reviewing reports, and managing minor administrative details. The dramatic battles fade when recounted in this tone. Instead, one observes a man attending to small details with obsessive patience, creating a rhythm of minor adjustments and persistent oversight. Courtiers and aides adapted to his peculiarities with practiced calm, producing a quiet, repetitive cadence that is hypnotically suitable for bedtime. Similarly, Marie-Louise of Austria, Napoleon's consort, lived a life of careful observation, gentle adjustment, and mild frustration. She navigated court protocol, family obligations, and ceremonial expectations with quiet diligence. Minor irritations, letters misdelivered, ceremonial errors, or slight delays in appointments recurred frequently but were managed without dramatic outbursts. This slow, measured rhythm creates a hypnotic narrative in which the listener drifts alongside the characters, observing human behavior in small, consistent pulses. Elsewhere, in Scandinavia, Gustav IV of Sweden combined personal devotion with minor eccentricities. His fascination with order, etiquette, and ceremonial propriety produced a reign filled with small, persistent challenges. Letters were carefully read, proclamations meticulously drafted, and minor missteps quietly corrected. The daily life of the court unfolded in a steady, predictable rhythm, perfect for sleepy reflection. Even political tension, when described in gentle, monotone fashion, becomes a series of small ripples rather than sudden waves. In France, Charles X lived a similarly structured, mildly eccentric life. He devoted himself to ceremonial obligations, garden walks, and careful oversight of court procedures. Minor disturbances, misaligned uniforms, misplaced seals, or letters incorrectly filed, produced gentle attention without producing alarm. Observed in this calm light, the history of Charles X is composed of repetitive, soothing patterns rather than dramatic narrative spikes. Even lesser-known monarchs and heirs exhibit the same quiet rhythm. Ferdinand VII of Spain combined personal indulgence with domestic attentiveness. His days were structured around minor ceremonial duties, family management, and the occasional hobby, producing a slow-moving narrative of human behavior. Miscommunications, small domestic challenges, and minor protocol errors recur like gentle waves, creating a hypnotic cadence ideal for bedtime listening. Royal children, too, contributed to this rhythmic narrative. Their education, minor illnesses, and domestic habits created a repetitive but gentle pattern. Tutors carefully guided lessons, nurses administered attention, and minor accidents or frustrations occurred without drama. The cumulative effect is soothing. The listener drifts through the minor struggles, eccentricities, and routines of the young royals, each day unfolding predictably and without sudden alarm. Even dynastic marriages, often fraught with political expectation, produced slow-moving patterns of minor tension rather than dramatic crises. Letters misinterpreted, small adjustments in court procedure, and gently persistent domestic disagreements all contributed to a rhythm that is hypnotically repetitive. The marriages of monarchs like Ferdinand VII and Maria Cristina, for example, create narrative pulses that are low stakes yet continuous, perfect for calming the mind. Across Europe, the story repeats itself. Monarchs, heirs, consorts, and courtiers all move in a gently coordinated rhythm. Minor eccentricities, domestic mishaps, and ceremonial quirks combine to produce a tapestry of softly repetitive human behavior. Wars, political disputes, and personal tragedies are often rendered gentle when observed slowly, with attention to small details and a calm narrative voice. The result is hypnotic, a historical lullaby composed of tiny ripples in the otherwise steady river of life. The repetition of these patterns, personal eccentricities, minor domestic crises, ceremonial mishaps, and slow political adjustments, forms a soothing cadence. Each chapter of history, each life observed in this monotone, becomes a gentle wave, slightly absurd, mildly tragic, but ultimately calming. The listener drifts along with the sequence, noticing small details, quiet frustrations, and gentle triumphs, all of which encourage relaxation rather than alarm. Even as we move into the 19th century, the same rhythm persists. Monarchs like Wilhelm I of Germany, Franz Joseph I of Austria, and Victor Emmanuel II of Italy maintain structured routines, minor eccentricities, and carefully managed domestic and ceremonial obligations. Their lives unfold predictably, punctuated by slow, deliberate adjustments rather than sudden drama. Observed in this way, history becomes a softly undulating current, moving past small obstacles and minor frustrations without ever alarming the listener. And so, across centuries and continents, from the Habsburgs to the Bourbons, from the Stuarts to the Romanovs, the gentle absurdities of royal life continue. Minor health issues, eccentric hobbies, domestic challenges, ceremonial mishaps, and slow-moving political adjustments create a hypnotic, continuous rhythm. Each anecdote blends seamlessly into the next, producing a narrative that soothes the mind, encourages reflection, and gently guides the listener toward rest. Chapter 9. Quiet Tragedies and Gentle Eccentricities. By the 19th century, European courts had developed an almost ritualized rhythm of life. Monarchs, consorts, and courtiers moved through daily routines with precise predictability, and minor misfortunes, eccentric habits, and domestic quirks created a gentle, hypnotic narrative. This is the kind of history that invites reflection, soft attention, and eventually, sleep. Consider Queen Victoria of Britain. She reigned for decades, and while her period is often remembered for industrial change, empire, and political reform, her personal life was composed of a series of slow, gentle rhythms. Her days involved managing household matters, overseeing the education of her children, writing letters, and attending court ceremonies. Minor inconveniences, misfiled correspondence, slightly late attendance, or small domestic errors produced mild tension that was quickly resolved with quiet authority. The overall effect, observed slowly and without dramatic emphasis, is calming rather than exciting. Victoria's children, raised with rigid attention to duty, exhibited their own minor eccentricities. Some were frail, others overly studious, and a few were prone to melancholy. The Queen responded with gentle, sometimes obsessive, management, ensuring that each child followed protocol while remaining under her quiet oversight. Letters of reprimand, careful scheduling of activities, and meticulously timed daily routines created a continuous, soporific rhythm that shaped both their lives and the court's atmosphere. Meanwhile, in Russia, Nicholas I presided over a court filled with elaborate ceremonies and slow-moving administrative processes. He personally supervised minor details of government, military organization, and household management, producing a reign that was predictable, orderly, and mildly eccentric. Courtiers and ministers navigated his exacting standards with polite diligence, attending to ceremonial correctness, minor bureaucratic errors, and personal preferences with constant, gentle attention. The cumulative effect is a historical narrative that moves at a relaxed pace, ideal for sleepy reflection. In France, Louis Philippe exemplified a quiet, domestic style of monarchy. He avoided dramatic public conflicts, focused on domestic stability, and engaged in minor personal hobbies such as gardening, reading, and hosting intimate court gatherings. The small inconveniences of domestic life, misplaced letters, a servant's minor error, or a ceremonial hiccup, produced mild ripples rather than waves, creating a steady, hypnotic rhythm in courtly life. Observed in this slow, monotone manner, history here is a gentle river of human habit. Elsewhere, in Scandinavia, Oscar I of Sweden maintained similarly measured routines. He was devoted to music, science, and careful oversight of minor political matters. His domestic habits, ceremonial attention, and personal interests shaped the court's rhythm in ways that were predictable, comforting, and gently amusing. Letters misfiled, reports slightly delayed, or ceremonial adjustments produced minor ripples, all managed quietly by advisors and staff accustomed to his steady pace. Even the smaller German principalities contributed to this hypnotic rhythm. Wilhelm I of Prussia, for example, was meticulous about routine, military inspections, and minor bureaucratic oversight. His personal eccentricities, occasional obsession with correct uniform arrangements or the precise timing of correspondence, produced small, repetitive cycles of minor adjustments. Courtiers moved with practiced efficiency, maintaining the continuity of life while gently accommodating his habits. The overall effect, narrated slowly and without urgency, is soothing. The minor tragedies of royal families further contribute to this gentle cadence. The loss of a child, a minor illness, or a quietly mismanaged household incident produces subtle emotional ripples rather than dramatic upheaval. In the 19th century, these soft misfortunes recur across dynasties. Queen Victoria's eldest daughter, Victoria, struggled with delicate health. Tsar Alexander II's children contended with minor illnesses and domestic restrictions. Lesser-known princes in the German states experienced slow, persistent physical ailments. Each incident is observed calmly, forming part of a continuous, lulling rhythm of historical life. Personal eccentricities are similarly hypnotic. Leopold II of Belgium enjoyed stamp collecting, careful correspondence, and detailed oversight of courtly ceremonies. His minor hobbies created repeated cycles of attention, reflection, and adjustment. Courtiers and family members responded with polite patience, observing minor lapses and gentle irritations as part of the natural order. In this way, even personal quirks, which might seem trivial to a distant observer, form a steady, soothing cadence when narrated slowly. The pattern of slow, repetitive, and minorly absurd incidents persists across Europe. Royal marriages, for example, provide gentle narratives of bureaucratic negotiation, domestic adjustment, and small-scale emotional management. Letters exchanged between families, slightly misaligned ceremonial arrangements, or minor disputes over protocol create a subtle rhythm rather than dramatic tension. From the Habsburgs to the Bourbons, from the Romanovs to the Wittelsbachs, the minor intricacies of dynastic life offer an endless series of gentle narrative pulses. Even political missteps and administrative failures, when observed at a slow, reflective pace, become soporific rather than alarming. A minister forgets to submit a report on time, a ceremonial proclamation is slightly delayed, a minor dispute over land titles drifts through bureaucratic channels. These are not dramatic crises, but small, recurring human adjustments that blend seamlessly into the steady flow of courtly life. The listener experiences history as a gentle, rhythmic sequence of minor perturbations in an otherwise stable world. Royal domestic life contributes further to this soothing narrative. Kitchens hum with the preparation of ceremonial meals. Attendants polish silverware, arrange flowers, and maintain linens. Children practice music and needlework under careful supervision. Each minor detail, when narrated slowly and without embellishment, produces a continuous rhythm of human diligence and domestic harmony. Even small mishaps, a slightly burnt meal, a misaligned chair, or a delayed courier, add to the gentle undulation of historical life. The long, repetitive pattern of European monarchs' lives, structured routines, minor eccentricities, gentle tragedies, and slowly resolved mishaps, creates a hypnotic cadence. Each story, each anecdote, unfolds predictably and consistently. Courtiers sigh softly, monarchs adjust minor irritations, and the vast machinery of court life moves steadily onward. Observed in a calm, monotone narrative, the effect is soothing, a gentle, historical lullaby composed of minor human foibles and persistent routines. Chapter 10: Gentle Absurdities of Modern Monarchs. As we drift into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, European monarchs continued the long tradition of quiet, predictable eccentricities, minor domestic dramas, and gently absurd personal habits. By now, courts were highly bureaucratized, ceremonial routines were rigorously observed, and minor inconveniences repeated like gentle, lulling waves. Take Edward VII of Britain, who reigned for a relatively short time but whose personal habits were quietly amusing. He adored fine food, long walks, and gentle social intrigue. His court moved around his leisurely routines, adjusting to his tastes for carefully timed meals, minor misalignments in protocol, or occasional disputes over who was seated where at dinner. Observed slowly, these small adjustments and minor social squabbles form a hypnotic, rhythmic narrative. Courtiers tiptoed through etiquette, letters were delivered with care, and minor domestic errors were quietly corrected. Nothing erupted into chaos. Everything unfolded in soft, deliberate succession. Across the Channel, Wilhelm II of Germany presided over a court filled with ceremonial detail, minor bureaucratic friction, and personal quirks. He enjoyed long walks, detailed letters, and frequent, mildly eccentric interventions in minor governmental procedures. Advisors, accustomed to his rhythms, quietly adjusted schedules, paperwork, and minor ceremonial routines, producing a softly repetitive cadence. The slight frustrations of staff and ministers, misfiled documents, incorrectly arranged reports, or small lapses in etiquette become gentle ripples in a steady historical current when observed in a calm, monotone narrative. In Russia, Nicholas II led a life marked by the predictable tension between ceremonial obligation and personal retreat. He enjoyed family life, quietly attending to his children, and the occasional personal interest in hunting, photography, and domestic management. His court, meticulously structured around protocol, responded to minor irritations and gentle eccentricities with patience. Letters misplaced or delayed, ceremonial robes slightly out of place, and small domestic mishaps occurred frequently, yet all were absorbed into the ongoing rhythm of palace life. Observed slowly, the narrative is hypnotic rather than alarming, small, persistent ripples of human behavior flowing through time. Royal children, especially in this period, contributed significantly to the gentle rhythm of life. The offspring of Edward VII, Wilhelm II, and Nicholas II were carefully educated, supervised, and observed for minor health issues or eccentric behaviors. Tutors, governesses, and attendants navigated these small challenges quietly, ensuring that minor accidents, mild illnesses, and domestic frustrations were managed with discretion. The result is a slow-moving, rhythmic narrative, where each day unfolds predictably and without drama, perfectly suited for reflective listening. Even personal eccentricities of monarchs create subtle, soporific amusement. Edward VIII of Britain, who later abdicated, had an enduring interest in automobiles, informal social engagements, and personal comfort. His preferences influenced court routines, domestic schedules, and minor ceremonial arrangements, producing a gentle pulse of minor adjustments. Courtiers accommodated his whims with practiced patience, ensuring continuity and calm in day-to-day operations. The repetitive nature of these adjustments forms a soothing, hypnotic narrative when observed in slow detail. Similarly, European queens displayed quiet, persistent habits that contributed to the steady rhythm of palace life. Alexandra of Denmark, wife of Edward VII, maintained routines of domestic attention, personal hobbies, and ceremonial oversight. Minor inconveniences, letters misdelivered, arrangements slightly awry, or household duties requiring correction, produced small, repetitive ripples rather than dramatic conflict. The repetition of these gentle occurrences, when narrated in a calm, monotone voice, forms a continuous, soporific rhythm. Elsewhere, in Belgium, King Leopold II's personal obsessions with architecture, urban planning, and domestic management produced a slow, hypnotic cadence of events. Minor misalignments in project plans, ceremonial procedures, or household routines were quietly corrected by staff, creating a soft, continuous rhythm. Even the occasional frustration or delay contributed to this gentle, predictable pattern rather than any sudden drama. In Scandinavia, the courts of Norway and Sweden maintained similar patterns of slow-moving eccentricities. Monarchs such as Oscar II of Sweden navigated ceremonial duties, minor political responsibilities, and domestic habits with meticulous attention. Their minor frustrations, misfiled letters, slight errors in ceremonial processions, or minor domestic disturbances were managed carefully, producing a steady cadence of gently unfolding events. The cumulative effect is hypnotic, as these small disturbances are woven into the continuous rhythm of royal life. Even political crises, when observed slowly and gently, contribute to this soporific pattern. Wars, minor rebellions, or dynastic disputes were often experienced incrementally, letters delivered, envoys dispatched, ceremonial decrees issued. The drama of these events is muted by bureaucratic pacing, ceremonial attention, and personal eccentricities of the monarchs involved. Observed in slow detail, they form soft pulses in the ongoing rhythm of history rather than abrupt shocks or peaks. Minor domestic tragedies, childhood illnesses, small household accidents, or delayed correspondence also repeat gently across the 19th and early 20th centuries. Tsar Nicholas II's children experienced regular bouts of delicate health, supervised closely by governesses and attendants. Letters were written with meticulous care, meals timed precisely, and minor incidents quietly managed. Each occurrence fits neatly into the broader rhythm of court life, producing a lulling, predictable cadence. In Germany, Wilhelm II's younger relatives and cousins contributed similarly to the slow, repetitive rhythm of royal life. Minor quarrels, ceremonial missteps, and domestic mishaps were absorbed into a gently repeating pattern. Letters, instructions, and observations flowed through the bureaucracy like a steady stream. Courtiers learned to anticipate minor eccentricities, advisors managed minor frustrations, and life continued without sudden interruption. The resulting narrative is hypnotic, composed of repetitive, slightly absurd human routines unfolding in predictable succession. Across Europe, the pattern is consistent. Monarchs, heirs, consorts, and courtiers navigate ceremonial expectations, personal eccentricities, domestic management, and minor frustrations in a slow, predictable rhythm. Even historical events that might seem dramatic in brief summaries, wars, political tensions, or public scandals, can be softened when observed in their long, incremental unfolding. Letters sent, small misunderstandings corrected, and daily routines maintained create a gentle, hypnotic pulse. The cumulative effect of these centuries of gentle absurdities, minor mishaps, and slowly unfolding domestic and ceremonial routines is soporific. From Edward VII to Nicholas II, from Wilhelm II to Oscar II, history becomes a river of small disturbances, minor eccentricities, and carefully managed human behavior. Each anecdote, minor incident, and domestic adjustment forms a continuous, soothing rhythm, inviting the listener to reflect, relax, and drift toward sleep. And so, the pattern continues. Subtle eccentricities, minor misfortunes, slow-moving domestic dramas, ceremonial adjustments, and gentle repetition. Royal lives, observed slowly and narrated calmly, become a hypnotic sequence of human quirks, small frustrations, and persistent routines. The steady rhythm of these historical details encourages the mind to relax, the body to settle, and sleep to approach quietly as the river of history flows gently onward. Chapter 11: 20th Century Royals and Their Gentle Quirks. As we glide into the 20th century, Monarchies continued their long tradition of quiet eccentricities, slow-moving domestic dramas, and ceremonial minutiae that create a gentle, hypnotic rhythm. Even as political upheaval and war swept across Europe, the personal routines and peculiar habits of royals offered an endlessly repetitive, soporific narrative. Consider King George V of Britain. He navigated the challenges of modern monarchy with calm diligence, maintaining ceremonial routines, overseeing domestic matters, and attending to the education and minor peculiarities of his children. His hobbies, stamp collecting, photography, and careful attention to protocol, provided a gentle structure to daily life. Minor inconveniences, such as misplaced letters or slightly delayed reports, were absorbed into the smooth operation of the court. The repetitive rhythm of daily tasks, family obligations, and ceremonial duties produces a slow, lulling cadence, perfect for bedtime reflection. His children, including Edward VIII and George VI, were educated under strict but gentle oversight. Lessons in etiquette, history, and languages were punctuated by minor incidents: a misbehaving tutor, a delayed assignment, or an occasional domestic mishap. Each incident was quietly managed, producing a gentle pulse of minor disruptions and corrections. Observed slowly, these domestic routines, combined with personal quirks, create a hypnotic rhythm, an endless, repeating pattern of human behavior unfolding predictably. Across the Channel, the Belgian royal family maintained similar habits. Albert I, a king devoted to family and ceremonial duty, navigated minor domestic inconveniences, political obligations, and personal eccentricities with patience. Courtiers adjusted gently to small lapses in protocol, letters misfiled, and minor errors in ceremonial procedures. His daily life unfolded predictably: early mornings, carefully planned meals, afternoon walks, and evenings of correspondence or reading. The continuity of these repetitive, minor events creates a calming narrative rhythm. In the Netherlands, Queen Wilhelmina spent much of her reign attending to ceremonial duties, domestic routines, and family obligations with meticulous care. Her personal habits, early rising, careful correspondence, and management of minor household and courtly tasks, produced a gentle cadence. The soft repetition of letters, ceremonial observations, and minor domestic adjustments, when narrated in a calm, monotone voice, becomes hypnotic. Even small domestic mishaps, a slightly misarranged bouquet, a letter delayed, or a minor clothing error, blend into the steady rhythm of court life. The Romanovs in Russia continued to offer examples of gently tragic domestic rhythms. Nicholas II, Alexandra, and their children navigated health issues, domestic supervision, and ceremonial obligations in a highly structured, repetitive pattern. The children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, exhibited minor eccentricities, delicate health concerns, and predictable routines, all carefully monitored by attendants and governesses. These minor disruptions, combined with the ceremonial and administrative duties of the court, produced a hypnotic, almost lullaby-like narrative, a steady pulse of domestic life and minor misfortune. Even Edward VIII, before his abdication, demonstrated small personal quirks and leisurely habits that shaped court routines. His fondness for informal social gatherings, leisurely mornings, and personal comfort introduced minor adjustments to ceremonial expectations. Courtiers moved carefully to accommodate these eccentricities, producing a gentle rhythm of domestic and ceremonial life. Letters, schedules, and minor arrangements were managed incrementally, creating a soothing narrative of slow-moving royal behavior. Similarly, European monarchs in Scandinavia maintained predictably gentle routines. Gustav V of Sweden navigated ceremonial duties, domestic supervision, and minor personal hobbies with quiet diligence. Letters misdirected, ceremonial robes slightly misaligned, and household errors were corrected methodically. Courtiers and staff learned to anticipate these minor disturbances, maintaining continuity while producing a hypnotic cadence of small, repetitive events. Even lesser-known royals continued this gentle pattern. The Spanish Bourbons, for instance, balanced domestic supervision, ceremonial obligations, and minor personal eccentricities across multiple generations. Alfonso XIII, his children and extended family experienced minor domestic mishaps, bureaucratic delays, and ceremonial adjustments that repeated consistently, producing a soporific rhythm. The predictable pattern of small corrections, minor frustrations, and gentle oversight forms a continuous, hypnotic narrative. World events, even when dramatic in headlines, often introduced only incremental adjustments to royal routines. Letters crossed borders, envoys negotiated ceremonial or minor political matters, and domestic arrangements adapted quietly. Even wars, revolutions, or abdications unfold slowly in the daily life of royals. Minor inconveniences, delayed correspondence, and adjusted routines dominate over sudden upheaval when narrated in a calm, monotone voice. The repetition of these small adjustments produces a lulling rhythm, suitable for slow, reflective listening. Minor domestic tragedies, childhood illness, small household accidents, or delicate health concerns continued to contribute to this pattern. Across Europe, royal children were carefully monitored by governesses and attendants. Meals, lessons, and recreational activities were scheduled meticulously. Small deviations, a mislaid letter, a slightly delayed meal, or a minor illness, produced gentle ripples, absorbed into the slow rhythm of domestic life. Observed slowly, these minor tragedies contribute to a hypnotic cadence of human behavior, perfectly suited for bedtime reflection. Personal eccentricities also created a subtle rhythm. Kings and queens, princes and princesses often maintained repetitive hobbies: stamp collecting, music, horseback riding, photography, embroidery, and garden tending. Courtiers adjusted to these habits with quiet patience, maintaining ceremonial continuity while accommodating eccentricities. These small, recurring adjustments form a steady pulse of human activity that, when narrated in slow detail, is hypnotic and soporific. Even royal marriages contribute to this gentle pattern. Letters exchanged, minor disagreements over protocol, and domestic adjustments recur predictably across centuries. Dynastic marriages, while politically significant, often unfold in predictable domestic rhythms. Children educated, ceremonial duties maintained, and minor eccentricities accommodated. These repeated patterns of behavior create a soft, continuous narrative pulse, lulling the listener gently through centuries of royal life. Across the 20th century, the cumulative effect of these slow-moving patterns is hypnotic. Minor domestic mishaps, ceremonial adjustments, personal eccentricities, and bureaucratic delays combine to produce a continuous, soporific cadence. Monarchs, children, consorts, and courtiers navigate life in repetitive, gentle patterns. Even political events, dramatic when summarized briefly, unfold in a series of small, manageable adjustments in daily practice. The result is a calm, continuous rhythm, history as a river of minor disturbances and gentle human behavior, flowing slowly past the attentive listener. In this way, the narrative of modern monarchy, Edward VII, George V, Wilhelm II, Nicholas II, Edward VIII, Gustav V, Alfonso XIII, and their contemporaries, offers endless examples of gently absurd domestic management, minor eccentricities, slow ceremonial repetition, and continuous, predictable adjustments. Each small disruption, minor domestic mishap, or ceremonial error contributes to the hypnotic pulse, forming a continuous lullaby of human behavior perfectly suited to guide the listener toward relaxation and sleep. Chapter 12. The Last Gentle Rhythms of European Royals. As the 20th century progressed, European monarchs found themselves navigating a world that was changing faster than any ceremonial protocol could adapt. Yet, despite revolutions, wars, and social upheaval, the domestic and personal rhythms of royals persisted in a slow, gentle, and slightly absurd fashion. The familiar cadence of minor eccentricities, domestic adjustments, ceremonial repetition, and small personal quirks continued to dominate their daily lives. Take Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother of Britain. Even during times of political upheaval, her daily routines were anchored in predictable habits: early rising, careful attention to correspondence, family meals, and domestic supervision. Minor disturbances, a mislaid letter, a slightly misaligned table setting, or a delayed carriage produced small, repetitive ripples that required gentle correction. Courtiers and household staff, accustomed to her precise habits, navigated these minor disturbances with quiet patience. The overall effect, when observed slowly, is hypnotic, a soft, continuous rhythm of human behavior. Her daughter, Elizabeth II, inherited many of these domestic and ceremonial patterns. The young princess's days were structured around lessons, domestic routines, and ceremonial obligations, all supervised with gentle diligence. Minor mishaps, misplaced homework, delayed correspondence, or small domestic adjustments recurred predictably. Even when political matters demanded attention, much of daily life remained governed by the quiet pulse of domestic and ceremonial routine. The cumulative effect of these repetitions, narrated in a calm, monotone voice, is a hypnotic lullaby of royal life. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, King Gustav VI Adolf of Sweden combined personal hobbies, ceremonial duties, and domestic oversight with a steady hand. His days were filled with slow-moving rhythms, carefully timed correspondence, visits to gardens or museums, and minor adjustments to household routines. Courtiers accommodated his personal eccentricities, such as a fondness for archaeology or detailed botanical observation, ensuring continuity while gently managing minor disruptions. Letters misdirected, ceremonial arrangements slightly off, and household mishaps all became part of this soothing, repetitive cadence. In Belgium, King Leopold III navigated a tumultuous political landscape with careful adherence to personal and ceremonial routines. Even during times of crisis, his domestic habits, early rising, careful correspondence, and methodical attention to family affairs, produced a predictable rhythm. Courtiers, staff, and family members adjusted incrementally to minor mishaps, delayed letters, slightly misaligned schedules, or minor domestic errors. Observed slowly, these repetitive patterns are calming rather than alarming, a gentle stream of human activity flowing continuously through the palace. Spain's royal family, particularly Juan Carlos and his contemporaries, maintained similar patterns of domesticity and ceremonial repetition. Household routines, minor eccentricities, and the quiet management of minor family mishaps structured daily life. Letters, small miscommunications, and ceremonial adjustments produced a gentle, predictable rhythm which, when narrated calmly, becomes soporific. The repetition of minor adjustments and predictable domestic patterns creates a hypnotic cadence that encourages reflection and relaxation. Even in Italy, monarchs such as Umberto II maintained highly structured daily routines punctuated by minor eccentricities. Ceremonial duties, domestic management, and family supervision proceeded according to predictable schedules. Small inconveniences, misfiled documents, minor protocol errors, or slight household disruptions occurred frequently but were absorbed into the ongoing rhythm of court life. Each minor event fits seamlessly into a continuous, soothing narrative of human behavior. Personal eccentricities, hobbies, and minor domestic mishaps across these 20th century courts create endless opportunities for gentle storytelling. Kings and queens collected stamps, observed birds, tended gardens, or wrote letters with meticulous attention. Courtiers adapted with quiet patience, attending to minor lapses, ceremonial misalignments, or domestic errors. The repetition of these small adjustments produces a hypnotic pulse, a continuous lullaby of human behavior unfolding predictably across generations. Even political upheaval, abdication, and exile can be observed through this slow-moving lens. Monarchs adjusted incrementally to changing circumstances. Letters delivered, ceremonial routines adapted, domestic life maintained. Revolutions, wars, and constitutional changes are experienced in small, manageable increments, as courtiers, advisors, and family members accommodate each shift with polite diligence. The narrative remains continuous, soft, and soporific, perfect for a listener seeking slow, calming historical flow. The lives of royal children continue to contribute to this gentle rhythm. From early education to minor health concerns, domestic habits, and ceremonial training, each small detail is repeated and managed with consistent attention. Tutors, governesses and household staff respond to minor incidents, slightly delayed meals, misplaced items, or small misbehaviors, without dramatic response. The result is a predictable hypnotic rhythm, the slow, continuous unfolding of human life within royal households. Ceremonial mishaps and minor administrative frustrations are similarly calming. A misplaced program, slightly misaligned robe, or delayed correspondence becomes a gentle ripple, absorbed by the court machinery with quiet efficiency. Letters are corrected, schedules adjusted, and domestic or ceremonial errors quietly resolved. The repetition of these small disturbances, observed incrementally over decades, forms a soft, soporific cadence that invites reflection and rest. Even when tragedies occur, illness, the death of a family member, or small political disappointments, the effects are gentle in the larger rhythm of domestic and ceremonial life. Mourning periods, formal adjustments, and careful observation of personal and family duties produce minor, incremental ripples rather than sudden shocks. The narrative remains soothing, composed of small, recurring events unfolding predictably. Across Europe, from Britain to Scandinavia, Belgium to Spain, Italy to smaller principalities, the pattern is clear. Monarchs, heirs, and courtiers operate in a slow, carefully measured rhythm of domestic life, ceremonial obligation, personal eccentricity, and minor disruption. Letters, small errors, and tiny personal quirks create a steady pulse, a continuous and hypnotic historical cadence. By the end of the 20th century, the repetition of domestic routines, ceremonial adjustments, personal hobbies, minor eccentricities, and gentle tragedies creates a soothing historical lullaby. From Edward VII to Elizabeth II, Wilhelm II to Nicholas II, Leopold III to Umberto II, the minor disruptions, slow corrections, and predictable domestic rhythms of royal life provide endless material for calm, soporific storytelling. The listener drifts alongside these repetitive, gentle patterns, eyes growing heavy, mind softening, as centuries of human behavior unfold at a slow, hypnotic pace. Chapter 13. Wrapping up the gentle currents of royal life. As we approach the end of our long, slow journey through centuries of European royalty, it's worth pausing to notice the persistent, soothing rhythms that thread through these stories. Despite wars, revolutions, political upheavals, and societal change, the daily lives of monarchs continue to revolve around predictable domestic routines, minor eccentricities, ceremonial repetition, and gentle personal quirks. These are the moments that, when narrated slowly, form a continuous, hypnotic cadence, perfect for reflection and rest. Even in the later generations of 20th century monarchs, the patterns remain familiar. Queen Elizabeth II, throughout her long reign, balanced family obligations, ceremonial duties, and personal routines with meticulous care. The small, recurring mishaps, letters slightly delayed, ceremonial arrangements adjusted at the last minute, minor health concerns, produced predictable ripples in palace life. Courtiers, staff, and family members responded with quiet diligence, maintaining a smooth, continuous rhythm. The repetition of these minor adjustments, daily rituals, and ceremonial observances creates a soft, gentle pulse, lulling the mind slowly toward relaxation. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, the royal families continued their quietly eccentric routines. King Carl XVI Gustav of Sweden, for instance, manages ceremonial obligations, minor domestic duties, and personal hobbies like sailing and philately. Slightly delayed correspondence, minor adjustments in protocol, and domestic inconveniences are absorbed calmly by the staff and courtiers. The resulting sequence of events is repetitive, predictable, and hypnotically soothing, a gentle, unbroken stream of human behavior unfolding in a slow, reflective rhythm. Across Europe, the Belgian, Dutch, and Spanish royal families continue to operate under similar patterns. Letters, domestic adjustments, ceremonial routines, minor misalignments in protocol, and small personal eccentricities recur predictably. Even as political landscapes shift and societal expectations change, these daily rhythms create continuity, offering gentle structure and consistency. Observed in slow detail, they form a hypnotic narrative of human behavior, repetitive, mildly absurd, and quietly reassuring. Royal children consistently provide another layer of gentle rhythm. Their education, minor illnesses, domestic supervision, and ceremonial training create a pattern of repetitive, low-stakes events. Tutors, governesses, and household staff respond to small disruptions, such as misplaced items, delayed tasks, or minor accidents, with quiet patience. Over years, the accumulation of these small, repetitive episodes forms a continuous, soothing historical cadence. Observed slowly and calmly, the minor struggles, domestic management, and ceremonial training of royal children offer a hypnotic narrative that invites rest. Even personal hobbies, often eccentric and repetitive, contribute to this soporific rhythm. From gardening to stamp collecting, embroidery to photography, music to small-scale scholarly pursuits, monarchs' interests produce minor cycles of attention, observation, and incremental adjustment. Courtiers and family members accommodate these hobbies with practiced patience, maintaining the ceremonial and domestic order while responding gently to small lapses or eccentricities. The repetition of these small routines, observed in calm detail, forms a gentle, continuous pulse. Minor tragedies, when they occur, follow the same slow, incremental rhythm. Health issues, brief illnesses, domestic accidents, and minor political frustrations ripple through palace life, gently absorbed and adjusted for over days or weeks. Mourning periods, ceremonial adjustments, and household corrections become part of the ongoing, predictable rhythm. Nothing erupts suddenly. All small misfortunes are managed within the measured cadence of routine, forming a soft, reflective narrative. The repetition of ceremonial routines adds another layer of hypnotic continuity. Daily schedules, weekly rituals, annual commemorations, and long-standing traditions create predictable cycles. Minor misalignments, a robe slightly off, a program delayed, a letter misfiled, become small ripples in the otherwise steady current. Observed slowly, these recurring cycles form a gentle pattern, a lullaby of minor human imperfections set against the enduring backdrop of formal continuity. Even political and societal change, when filtered through these domestic and ceremonial rhythms, becomes less abrupt and more soporific. Letters crossed, schedules adjusted, domestic routines modified. Each incremental adjustment blends into the slow, repeating cycles of court life. Wars, political crises, and abdications may disrupt the broader environment, but within the domestic sphere, the rhythm of minor eccentricities, ceremonial repetition, and predictable adjustment remains constant. The listener, relaxed and attentive, drifts gently along these soft currents of history. From Britain to Sweden, Belgium to Spain, the Netherlands to smaller principalities, the common pattern endures. Monarchs, heirs, consorts, courtiers, and attendants navigate a world of small domestic adjustments, ceremonial routines, personal hobbies, and minor eccentricities. Each small disruption is absorbed, corrected, or adjusted incrementally, producing a continuous, predictable rhythm. The cumulative effect is hypnotic, a river of human behavior that flows gently through centuries, gradually lulling the listener toward reflection, relaxation, and sleep. By now, the repetitive, slightly absurd patterns of royal life, letters delayed, garments adjusted, minor accidents quietly managed, hobbies tended, ceremonial routines repeated, domestic frustrations resolved, have produced a gentle, continuous cadence. Observed in slow, monotone narration, history becomes a stream of soft, predictable rhythms, punctuated by minor eccentricities and gentle misfortunes. The mind, absorbing these continuous patterns, begins to soften, relax, and drift along with the steady pulse of time. In conclusion, the study of monarchs, heirs, consorts, and their households across centuries offers a unique perspective on human behavior, repetitive, slightly absurd, occasionally tragic, and endlessly predictable. From the eccentricities of medieval kings to the careful domestic management of 20th century monarchs, the continuous patterns of life, ceremonial attention, personal hobbies, and minor domestic mishaps create a hypnotic, soporific rhythm. The listener, reclining in quiet, dim light, is gently carried along by these currents, through centuries of history, into the soft, reflective comfort of sleep. The gentle pulse of historical routine, personal eccentricity, ceremonial repetition, and minor domestic adjustment continues without abrupt peaks or sudden shocks. Each anecdote, each small misfortune, each minor eccentricity contributes to a soothing, hypnotic narrative. The rhythm persists, soft and continuous, guiding the listener through the centuries of royal life, into quiet reflection and toward rest. Chapter 14. The Gentle Echoes of Centuries. As we drift toward the final segments of this long, hypnotic journey, it becomes clear that the small, repetitive rhythms of royal life are the true heartbeat of European history. Across centuries, from medieval castles to 20th century palaces, monarchs and their households have moved in patterns that are soothing, slightly absurd, and endlessly predictable. Letters misdelivered, minor domestic mishaps, ceremonial adjustments, and personal eccentricities ripple gently through time, forming a soft, continuous narrative. Even the most famous figures, when observed in a calm, monotone narrative, reveal habits that are minorly amusing, gently tragic, and quietly repetitive. George III's meticulous attention to gardens and household affairs, Victoria's patterned domestic routines, Nicholas II's children's delicate health concerns, all these details combine to create a hypnotic, soothing rhythm. Nothing erupts suddenly, each incident, each adjustment, flows gently into the next, forming a soft river of historical continuity. Consider the later European royals, like Queen Elizabeth II and her contemporaries. Their lives are punctuated by predictable routines, correspondence, domestic supervision, ceremonial obligations, and carefully tended hobbies. Minor domestic disruptions, a misaligned letter, a delayed report, a slightly late ceremonial rehearsal, are quietly absorbed. Courtiers and household staff adjust incrementally, maintaining smooth continuity. Observed in slow, reflective detail, these recurring cycles create a continuous, soporific rhythm. Across Scandinavia, Belgium, Spain, and the Netherlands, monarchs and their families demonstrate the same gentle pattern. Daily routines, ceremonial repetition, minor mishaps, and personal quirks recur predictably. Even political upheavals, which might seem dramatic in headlines, translate into incremental adjustments in household life. Letters, schedules, ceremonial sequences, and domestic supervision adapt slowly and quietly. The repetition of these small events produces a calming, hypnotic cadence. Royal children, consistent across centuries, contribute additional waves of gentle rhythm. Their education, minor health issues, ceremonial training, and domestic guidance unfold predictably. Tutors, governesses, and attendants manage slight mishaps, forgotten lessons, delayed meals, small accidents, with quiet patience. These small events accumulate into a long, continuous pattern of repetitive domestic and ceremonial life, perfect for reflective listening. Hobbies and personal eccentricities also form part of this soft, soporific current. Monarchs collected stamps, practiced music, gardened, observed nature, or pursued minor scholarly interests. Courtiers and family members accommodated these habits with quiet attention, correcting minor disruptions or gently adjusting routines. The repetition of these small actions over time produces a continuous pulse of minor human behavior, hypnotic in its predictability. Even minor tragedies and inconveniences, the brief illness of a child, delayed correspondence, slightly disrupted ceremonial arrangements, follow gentle, incremental rhythms. Mourning periods, household corrections, ceremonial adjustments, and minor bureaucratic delays produce soft ripples rather than sudden peaks. The slow, repetitive handling of these small challenges contributes to a continuous, soothing historical narrative. Across centuries, ceremonial routines amplify the hypnotic effect. Daily schedules, weekly rituals, annual commemorations, and formal traditions create predictable cycles. Small errors, slightly misaligned robes, minor protocol lapses, or delayed communications are absorbed into these cycles. The repetition of ceremonial and domestic life, combined with minor eccentricities and gentle human adjustments, forms a soft, continuous cadence, inviting calm reflection and eventual sleep. Political and societal upheaval, when filtered through these domestic and ceremonial rhythms, becomes incrementally manageable. Letters, minor bureaucratic adjustments, domestic corrections, and ceremonial adaptations occur quietly. Even major events like abdications, revolutions, or wars are absorbed slowly into the routine of court life. Incremental adjustments to daily schedules, ceremonial sequences, and household life produce a calming, continuous flow. The listener, reclining quietly, drifts along with this steady, hypnotic current. Minor domestic mishaps recur persistently. Delayed letters, misplaced items, minor errors in household routine, and slight misunderstandings among staff produce gentle ripples of activity. Courtiers respond patiently, correcting errors and maintaining continuity. Over years, these small, repetitive incidents create a continuous, soothing historical rhythm, a gentle pulse of human behavior across centuries, forming the backbone of a hypnotic narrative. Personal eccentricities contribute further to this lulling rhythm. Whether it is a king's fascination with philately, a queen's love of gardening, a princess's musical practice, or a prince's collection of curiosities, each minor habit produces small, predictable adjustments in the routines of those around them. Courtiers, attendants, and family members respond incrementally, producing a continuous cycle of minor events that gently flow into one another. The repetition of these eccentricities, minor mishaps, and domestic adjustments forms a hypnotic cadence. Even the grander dramas of history, political upheavals, constitutional change, or social transformation, fit into this slow-moving pattern when observed in the context of daily royal life. Letters, minor protocol corrections, domestic adjustments, and ceremonial oversight absorb much of the potential shock. The continuous management of minor events, domestic routine, and personal eccentricities creates a soft, unbroken pulse that is calming rather than alarming. Across Europe, from Britain to Sweden, Belgium to Spain, the Netherlands to smaller principalities, the repetition of domestic routines, ceremonial obligations, personal hobbies, minor eccentricities, and gentle tragedies produces a continuous, soporific flow. Monarchs, heirs, consorts, courtiers, and staff participate in these slow, predictable rhythms, creating a hypnotic narrative that stretches over centuries. The accumulation of small adjustments, repeated routines, and gently absurd domestic practices forms a lullaby-like cadence. The minor misfortunes and quirks, observed in slow detail, become comforting patterns. Slightly misfiled letters, delayed reports, minor health concerns, ceremonial errors, and household adjustments all contribute to a continuous rhythm. The repetition of these small events, managed incrementally and absorbed gently, forms a soft, reflective current. Observing these patterns, the listener drifts alongside them, eyes heavy, mind softening, carried gradually toward rest. Ultimately, the story of European monarchs, from medieval times to the 20th century, is less about dramatic peaks and sudden crises than about the continuous rhythm of human life. Minor mishaps, personal eccentricities, ceremonial repetition, domestic adjustments, and gentle tragedies dominate the narrative. Letters are corrected, robes are adjusted, meals are timed, and minor incidents are quietly resolved. These small, repetitive events create a hypnotic, soporific flow that carries the listener through centuries of human behavior, gradually coaxing the mind toward calm and sleep. The gentle, continuous pulse of historical life, slightly absurd, mildly tragic, and endlessly repetitive, remains the final, unifying rhythm of this long journey. Monarchs, consorts, heirs, courtiers, and staff participate in an unbroken pattern of minor adjustments, domestic supervision, ceremonial repetition, and personal quirks. Each small disruption, each incremental correction, each repeated routine contributes to the soothing current of history. Chapter 15. The Last Lull of Royal Life. As we arrive at the gentle conclusion of our long journey through centuries of European monarchs, it becomes clear that the enduring charm of these stories lies in their continuous, repetitive rhythms. The minor domestic mishaps, slight eccentricities, ceremonial adjustments, and incremental corrections of kings, queens, and their households form a hypnotic pulse that has carried us from medieval courts to the 20th century. These are not stories of dramatic battles or sudden upheaval, but of human life unfolding slowly, gently, and predictably. Even the most historically famous figures reveal quiet, soporific patterns when observed in slow detail. George III tended his gardens with care. Victoria supervised domestic routines and letters with exacting attention. Nicholas II managed the delicate schedules of his children with careful patience. Their minor frustrations, incremental corrections, and repeated domestic tasks form a soft, continuous rhythm. Observed in calm narration, these events provide a soothing, hypnotic current that drifts steadily across centuries. Queen Elizabeth II, whose reign spanned decades of political change, maintained the same gentle cadence. Her days, structured by ceremonial obligations, correspondence, and domestic supervision, were punctuated by small disturbances, letters slightly delayed, programs adjusted at the last minute, and minor domestic mishaps quietly managed. Courtiers and staff adapted incrementally, creating a continuous, predictable rhythm. The repetition of these routines, coupled with personal hobbies and family supervision, produces a hypnotic, lulling narrative. Across Europe, the minor eccentricities of monarchs add further texture to this continuous flow. Gustav V of Sweden, Albert I of Belgium, Alfonso XIII of Spain, and Umberto II of Italy each maintained small hobbies, domestic routines, and personal quirks. Courtiers, staff, and family members adjusted to these eccentricities with quiet patience. The repetition of letters, minor errors, domestic supervision, ceremonial oversight, and small personal habits forms a steady, soporific cadence that invites reflection and rest. Royal children, consistent across generations, contribute additional layers to this gentle rhythm. Their education, minor illnesses, ceremonial training, and domestic guidance unfold predictably. Tutors, governesses, and attendants respond to small disruptions, forgotten lessons, delayed meals, misplaced items, with quiet patience. The slow accumulation of these repeated incidents forms a continuous, soothing narrative. Each day blends into the next, minor adjustments absorbed incrementally, producing a hypnotic pulse of human behavior. Even political upheavals, when filtered through domestic and ceremonial routines, follow incremental patterns. Letters, minor bureaucratic adjustments, domestic corrections, and ceremonial adaptations occur quietly, absorbing potential shock. Wars, revolutions, abdications, and social transformations unfold in small, measured increments within the palace walls. The repetition of minor adjustments creates a continuous, calming flow, ideal for reflective, sleepy listening. Minor tragedies, gentle frustrations, and domestic mishaps recur persistently. Illnesses, delayed correspondence, slightly misaligned ceremonial arrangements, and minor errors in household routine ripple softly through royal life. Courtiers correct them incrementally, maintaining continuity. Over time, these small, repetitive events create a continuous, hypnotic historical rhythm, a river of minor disturbances flowing steadily through centuries, soft and unbroken. Hobbies, personal eccentricities, and leisurely pursuits add to the hypnotic effect. Monarchs gardened, collected stamps, practiced music, wrote letters, and observed nature. Courtiers and family accommodated these interests with quiet diligence. The repetition of small, incremental actions, minor corrections, adjustments, and observations produces a continuous pulse of behavior, soothing and predictable. Observed slowly, these habits are gently amusing and mildly comforting, forming a lullaby of human idiosyncrasy. Ceremonial repetition further reinforces the hypnotic rhythm. Daily schedules, weekly rituals, annual commemorations, and formal traditions create predictable cycles. Slightly misaligned robes, minor errors in protocol, and delayed programs become soft ripples absorbed within these cycles. Observed slowly, these patterns produce a continuous, gentle cadence, a stream of events that calms and reassures rather than excites or alarms. The continuous flow of minor domestic disruptions, ceremonial adjustments, and personal quirks demonstrates the enduring human patterns of life. Letters delayed, household mishaps corrected, clothing slightly misaligned, hobbies tended carefully, all contribute to the hypnotic pulse of royal life. This unbroken rhythm, stretching across centuries, encourages reflection, mental relaxation, and the slow descent into sleep. Even in the face of historical change, political upheaval, societal transformation, abdications, or wars, the domestic and ceremonial rhythms of monarchs persisted. Incremental adjustments, minor corrections, and gentle responses to small disruptions ensured continuity. Observed slowly and patiently, these repeated patterns form a continuous, soporific current, carrying the listener gently through the centuries of royal life. From medieval kings to 20th century queens, from minor principalities to major empires, the stories of monarchs are unified by this hypnotic rhythm. Minor eccentricities, domestic management, ceremonial repetition, personal hobbies, and incremental corrections flow endlessly, forming a gentle, continuous stream of human behavior. Each small disruption, each repeated routine, each mild frustration contributes to the soothing pulse, creating a historical lullaby for the attentive listener. As we bring this journey to a close, it is the repetition, the continuous, slightly absurd, mildly tragic, and endlessly predictable patterns of royal life that remains most memorable. Courtiers adjust robes, letters are corrected, meals are timed precisely, hobbies are indulged, domestic mishaps are quietly resolved. These gentle, incremental rhythms stretch across centuries, creating a soft, hypnotic narrative. The mind, absorbing these patterns, gradually relaxes, thoughts soften, and eyes grow heavy. The minor, repetitive, and slightly absurd rhythms of royal life, observed slowly, narrated calmly, absorbed gently, form the final lullaby. From Edward VII to Elizabeth II, Wilhelm II to Nicholas II, Leopold III to Umberto II, the patterns persist. Domestic adjustments, ceremonial routines, personal quirks, and minor frustrations all flowing continuously, quietly, predictably. The hypnotic pulse of history continues, soft and steady, carrying the listener gently toward sleep. And so, centuries of human life, domestic minutiae, ceremonial repetition, and personal eccentricity fade softly into memory. The letters remain slightly delayed, robes slightly misaligned, hobbies carefully tended, and minor eccentricities quietly observed. The steady, continuous pulse of human behavior flows gently onward, a historical lullaby, lulling the mind and body toward calm, reflection, and ultimately, sleep. With this, we conclude our slow, hypnotic journey through the lightly tragic, gently absurd, and endlessly repetitive world of European monarchs. A quiet, reflective stream of domestic mishaps, ceremonial adjustments, minor eccentricities, and incremental corrections carries on in memory long after the last words have been spoken. And now the mind may rest,